Hello everyone, it's the Fat Philosopher here, and I'm here with my Schecter Sun Valley Super Shredder, which kind of camouflages into the shirt, right? Anyways, we're here to talk about the guy most associated with the Super Shredder and the band, Van Halen, and why I think they should be considered a heavy metal album. Now I was a metalhead back in the late 80s and 90s, and one thing that kind of irritates me about today's present scene is how many metal gatekeepers are out there that like to insist that certain bands back from my era were not really metal. You see people go around, they say, you see people go around and say, Twisted Sister's not metal. Guns N' Roses, they're not metal. Def Leppard's not metal. Cannibal Corpse, they're not metal. Well, maybe not the last one, but you get the idea, right? One good example of this would be the book by Joel McIver, 100 Greatest Metal Guitarists. I bought this book because in this book he states that Dave Mustaine is the greatest heavy metal guitarist of all time, which I love because I love Dave Mustaine. But part of his reasoning getting there is he basically claims that all 80s glam metal and 70s original metal is not really metal. At the end of his book, he has a section where he says, "Shredders, not metalers," and that's just stating shredders, not metalers. And he makes this quote: "I notice on my top 100 list of heavy metal guitarists, not rock guitarists. I'm going to list here the phenomenal players who work sometimes straight into the metal arena, but are best known for fast and storied soloists rather than heavy metal songwriters." And these are the people he decides to leave out of his ranking of metal guitarists. So we have Eddie Van Halen, Randy Rhoads, Yngwie Malmsteen, Slash, Steve Vai, Nuno Bettencourt, George Lynch, Jakey Lee, Vinnie Moore, all these guys, and Jimmy Page. And all these guys he considers not to be metal guitarists. Kind of strange, like for example, Randy Rhoads and Jakey Lee, who played with Ozzy Osbourne, are not considered metal, but according to him, Zakk Wylde is considered metal, although he also played with Ozzy Osbourne. On the other side of that, he lists 31 death metal guitarists in the top 100 metal guitarists of all time. Quick, can you name 31 death metal bands? I can't, personally. Well, so basically what I'm saying, he really severely limits his definition of metal to fit in his own thinking. And basically all glam metal of the 80s is not considered to be metal at all. So that's a little bit of a separate debate, but I'm going to go straight into the idea that Eddie Van Halen and Van Halen, the group, are not a metal band, because it's often that picks up. You see on like YouTube, like people list the top 10 metal guitarists of all time, and if they put Van Halen in there in the comments, somebody would go, Van Halen is not a metal band. All these metal gatekeepers. So I'm going to try to argue against the philosophy of these people, like Joel McIver here, why Van Halen is a metal band, okay? Now, the first thing, you have to remember the time period it came out. Now, Van Halen, the original album was 78. So let's say you were a teenage kid in 1977 in America, and somebody came up and asked you, name 3 heavy metal bands. Now remember, the term heavy metal was around at that time, right? So name 3 heavy metals. What would they say? Now they'll probably say these bands in this order. They'll say 1. Led Zeppelin, 2. Deep Purple, 3. Black Sabbath. Now of course there are other bands out there that might put in Alice Cooper, Ted Nugent, Kiss, Aerosmith. Judas Priest is still not very well known at that time, in say 1977. But those were the bands that they considered metal. Now, a lot of these people, of course, would not consider Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, or maybe even Black Sabbath to be metal. There are people who don't think Black Sabbath are metal. However, in that time period, 1977, the idea of heavy metal existed, and heavy metal applied to these bands. Like I said, you get Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. Those are like the 3 main first invasion on British heavy metal, right? Now another thing you'd have to consider, it's 1970. Now how does this apply to Van Halen? Well, you also have to remember with Van Halen coming out in 78, that in 1977 people generally thought metal was on decline. I mean, record executives and the metal and the rock press had the idea that heavy metal was on the downside. And you can see why they thought this. First of all, you had Led Zeppelin, with like 2 years between Presence and Into the Outdoor with no material. Of course, they had a little bit of tragedy with Robert Plant's son and all. So they were kind of inactive for like almost 2 years, right? Then you had Deep Purple broke up in '76, and they wouldn't get back together until '84. So that's one of the bands out of the way. With Black Sabbath, you had Ozzy was really strung out on drugs at that time, and they were really also kind of seen as a band on the downside at that time until they replaced Ozzy, right? Now, when Van Halen, of course, started out as basically a bar band that did covers. What did they cover? They covered Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, and maybe some Cream and other bands that were considered the kind of very hard rock or metal at the time. The bar bands had to do covers at the time, and in the case they do like 5 covers and then put in one original song and then go back to doing 5 more covers. And they had a repertoire of 80 songs that they all knew for their bar gigs they would do during the week. So now as metal was in decline, the press and the record companies were looking for punk acts, right? And then they were looking at disco. Staying Alive was the biggest album of '78. And they're looking at soft rock acts such as Fleetwood Mac and Boston. Those were they thought was the future of rock music, and then metal was going to go into oblivion. So when Van Halen debuted in '78, a lot of people thought they're going to be washed up like these other metal bands that are being washed up at the time, and they didn't get really good reviews. Their record company actually wanted to associate it with something other than metal. For example, the album cover of the first Van Halen album was actually supposed to kind of look like a Clash kind of album vibe to it, and the band was against it. They made them redo the album cover because they didn't want that theme. But their label was actually the same label as Sex Pistols, and the label thought Sex Pistols were the future, and Van Halen was trying to copy something from the past. And so when the album came out, a lot of people were trying to associate Van Halen with heavy metal and as something that's going on the decline. For example, Rolling Stone came out and said something like, in 3 years Van Halen would go down the heavy metal toilet with Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. So Rolling Stone right there saying was basically Van Halen was a Zeppelin Deep Purple copy, and that like those bands that are going into obscurity, they will also go into obscurity in 3 years. So the band act to kind of fight against this image of that there being a metal band, that heavy metal was on the decline. But then again, they didn't want to be called a punk band either. So it kind of came up to David Lee Roth. Now you gotta remember, David Lee Roth his musical talents and influences very different from the Van Halen brothers. Alex and Eddie were very Black Sabbath, Deep Purple type of tone, playing in t-shirts and jeans kind of thing. But David Lee Roth lacked a lot of talent, had a lot less talent than those two did, and he was more like a David Bowie type of influence kind of guy. He was more into kind of the showmanship and looking into the image. So he came up with the idea. After all these music magazines and people are dodging him, why are you being metal? Metal's on the way out. So he came up and says, "Oh, we're not metal, we're a big rock," he called it, We're not hard rock, we're not metal, we're big rock. And he tried to, put a little distance in there between him and metal. But the fact turns out that these people were wrong. Punk was the one to die out, disco was the one to die out, and metal was the one to continue on. So as the 80s came around, the stigma of calling Van Halen a metal band was not really a stigma anymore. In other words, it's kind of a badge of honors. A lot of the glam metal bands of the 80s, whether it be Rat or Dokken, Motley Crue, a lot of based their images and stuff on Van Halen. But how about the music itself? Well, Van Halen, is a metal band, but they're not the same metal band like Zeppelin or Sabbath or Deep Purple were. They altered it the way metal was perceived. How do they do it? Well, first of all, on Van Halen 1, there's no 10-minute songs about hobbits, or, like something like the Zeppelin would do. Like say off of Presence, Achilles' Last Stand is, awesome song. I love it to death. But oh my God, it's 11 minutes long, and I really don't know what they're talking about in the song, right? You don't find that at all on Van Halen. The songs were made to be like singles. There's not a song over 4 minutes. I think Talking About Love is almost 4 minutes, but other ones are all less than that. Compare that to, say, Led Zeppelin Presence, where all the songs except for one are over 5 minutes, right? So the concept that a metal song had to be these long, winding, non-commercial type entities have changed. They used the same hard rockin' beat, the same type of distorted guitar tones, but just cut it out, made it a little bit more danceable, and made it a little shorter, so people can have singles. So they changed metal music. They didn't leave the genre, And people, in the 80s, they considered Van Halen to be a metal band. For example, Colin Larkin in, I think, 94 ranked the top 50 metal albums. And Van Halen 1 came in at number 8 all-time metal albums. So even up to the 90s, Van Halen was considered to be metal. So now some people say, well, the genre, when you look, that's what they might have considered at the time. But now that we have bands like Periphery, Meshuggah, Dream Theater, maybe like Avenged Sevenfold, that's true metal now, and these other bands weren't. Well, I don't know how you can decide that, because maybe, the heavy metal term has been along for a long while. And the people who used heavy metal back in the 70s had no knowledge of bands like Meshuggah, Dream Theater, all the Avenged Sevenfold, So maybe they should come up with a new term, new song, if they really don't want to be associated with those type of bands, the old 70s bands there. But then again, that's kind of a topic I like to go into something else, how to define metal. My argument, though, is if you look at the history of the genre and the people who were using the terms at the time, Van Halen fits right into the metal genre, and they're one of the biggest influences on metal acts at this time. So I see no problem in calling, say, Eddie Van Halen one of the greatest metal guitarists of all time, because it sure sounds metal to me. Anyways, that's just my thoughts on the subject there. Please tell me your own in the comments below, and good luck rocking out. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. Salut!